Hello, welcome back to my bookshelf. I'm Justine Brown, and today we're talking about King Arthur, which is surely Britain's most deeply rooted tale. Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, had a knack for myth-making. It was the 1480s, and the English people were bruised, battered, and exhausted, following decades of the nasty inter-cousin strife known as the Wars of the Roses. The Lancastrian Henry married Elizabeth of York in a symbolic reconciliation in 1486. 8 months later, Elizabeth gave birth to their first child, a son and heir. The couple christened him Arthur. The English people celebrated. As a name, it could scarcely have been more evocative or promising. In a deft piece of shorthand, Henry VII had elevated his family, authenticated his claim, underscored his British roots, he was part Welsh, and announced a hopeful new era of kingship. He had accomplished this by invoking the name of King Arthur, the most deeply rooted story cycle in Britain and beyond. We know King Arthur and his court from a multiplicity of sources, merging somewhere in prehistory and continuing unabated in our day. Folklore, legend, place name, poem, prose, song, painting, opera, film, novel, television, musical, video game, and so on. The presence of Arthurian parody, from Cervantes' poor deluded Don Quixote through to Monty Python, is a testament to our knowledge of the genre. Parody relies upon familiarity, after all. We would be unable to properly enjoy Monty Python's Holy Grail without already knowing King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, the quest for the Grail, and that watery tart, the Lady of the Lake. Like all myth, Arthur defies origins. We cannot point to a single beginning or main author. Instead, we have a great plurality. Of the more authoritative books, Sir Malory's Morte d'Arthur, in which William Caxton printed just as Henry VIII was coming to power, Henry VII was coming to power, pulls together variegated French and English Arthurian romances, which in turn have disparate sources. Le Morte d'Arthur is to Arthur what Ovid's Metamorphoses is to Greek myth, a compendium. The Arthurian tradition can be imagined as a massive choir with intermittent solo parts, or as an unfinished and ongoing tapestry with multiple weavers. It traverses high and popular culture. So while his mother and father read Sir Thomas Malory, young Arthur Tudor's wet nurse might have whispered him a fairy story that ran something like this. Once upon a time in Britain, there lived a sweet and modest youth named Arthur. The land awaited its rightful king. In that country there stood a large stone, within which was a sword buried to the hilt. The sword was called Excalibur, which means from the rock. It was said that only the true king could draw the sword from the stone. Many a mighty warrior had strained to draw Excalibur out, only to fail. But Arthur, young and mild, easily plucked the sword from the stone. Excalibur was his, and he was the one true king of the Britons. The people rejoiced. Only Morgan le Fay, Arthur's half-sister, could not be happy that Arthur was on the throne. The daughter of a fairy, she had been conceived and raised in secret. Hidden away and neglected, Morgan nursed resentment in her heart. She was as bitter as he was pure. She vowed to destroy King Arthur. The beautiful Morgan appeared to Arthur in dreams, beguiling him with magic. At length she lay with him. Morgan conceived and gave birth to a son, Mordred. Mordred grew strong and true, but his mother filled his ears with poison against his father. Meanwhile, a glorious court had gathered around King Arthur and his fair wife, Queen Guinevere. Merlin the Enchanter was at their side. Like a lodestone, Camelot drew the most virtuous men from far and near, soldiers sworn to champion the meek, right wrongs, and seek the Holy Grail. King Arthur, drawing Excalibur, knighted them in turn, Sir Launcelot, Sir Tristan, Sir Gawain, Sir Galahad, and many more. Together they formed the Knights of the Round Table, Arthur's council. Eventually they were joined by the mysterious Sir Mordred, and their adventures were as numberless as the stars in the sky. Of all his worthy knights, King Arthur loved Launcelot best. Sir Launcelot was dedicated to Arthur. He was Queen Guinevere's champion, but he conceived a passion for her, and she for him. Launcelot and Guinevere were caught in the thorns, torn between their loyalty to their king and their longing for each other. It was a division that would soon give Mordred his opening, and lead to the dissolution of the Round Table and the destruction of the one true king of the Britons. Scholars argue about the nature of the historical strands in the Arthurian tapestry, but it's important to note that the legend of King Arthur emerges out of a time, the 5th century A.D., when the Britons were under sustained attack from without. Britain had been occupied by the Romans from about 55 A.D. to 409, when the last of the legions retreated. The empire was disintegrating. This meant that the Britons, who had grown reliant on the Romans, were now vulnerable. Britons were unused to battle now, and so the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes from Germany and modern-day Denmark, as well as neighboring tribes like the Picts and Irish, were taking advantage. The Britons issued a final plaintive plea to Rome for assistance, but none came. The Romans had other worries dealing with uprisings all over the empire. The 6th century Welsh monk Gildas describes the situation this way. The barbarians drive us to the sea, and the sea throws us back on the barbarians. Between these two kinds of death we are either drowned or slaughtered. Gildas references one Ambrosius, a 5th century indigenous British warlord, successfully fighting off Saxon invaders. It was exactly what the Britons were hoping for. Historian Christopher Hibbert characterizes this as a last stand of the old culture. The Arthur figure of legend seems to be a composite of Ambrosius and his successor. Arthur could derive from Artos, the Welsh word for bear. Ambrosius may have been nicknamed for the bear pelt military tunic he wore. It was certainly common for pagan warriors to identify with bears as a source of strength. Other commentators point to the Welsh bear god. Any faint historicity to Arthur is completely overwhelmed by a thickly layered glaze of mythos, especially Christian allegory, baked in. But what the legendary Arthur shares with the mythical Arthur that we know better is this. He is the defender of the old ways, the true king of the British people. He fights against extraordinary odds. He embodies the hero archetype. We celebrate the Davids of this world, those who take on Goliath. The figure of Arthur, the 5th century Briton, resembles that of Boudica, the tribal queen, fully historical, who led a powerful but ultimately doomed uprising against the Romans. Gildas was among those who fled to Brittany to escape the depredations of the Saxons and others. Modern-day Bretons descend from that exodus. This helps to explain the prevalence of Arthurian stories in France, for Arthur is almost as popular there as he is in Britain, as well as, perhaps, the quality of nostalgia that characterizes Arthurian romance, the longing for a lost world which never actually existed. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, History of the Kings of Britain, written in the 1130s, is now read as myth-making, but in the 12th century many took it literally. Geoffrey presents King Arthur as a historical figure, gesturing at a far-off time when knights, as defenders of the weak, were governed by perfect courtly manners and virtues, piety, honesty, valor, loyalty, generosity, honor. Chaucer's knight is typical. He, quote, loved chivalry, truth and honor, freedom and courtesy." Unquote. We think of the Middle Ages as the age of chivalry, but the medievals themselves look to a previous age. Chivalry, the code of ideal knightly conduct, always entails some kind of revival. It is an ever-receding horizon, always positioned just out of reach. King Arthur is known for having touched but failed to maintain perfection. The genre is elegiac in tone. In Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the anonymous poet describes, quote, "Camelot at Christmastide. High were their hearts in halls and chambers. These lords and these ladies, for life was sweet. In peerless pleasures they passed their days. The most noble knights known under Christ, and the loveliest ladies that were on earth ever. And he the comeliest king that court holds, for all this fair folk were in their first age. It is a kind of golden age as yet undimmed." Henry VII's name for his son tells us everything we need to know about his hopes for the House of Tudor. Henry sought to convey to the people that his house was deeply rooted in Britain, descended from its most celebrated king. He had even ensured that Arthur was born at Winchester, then thought to be the site of Camelot. Here was an heir who would bring stability and devote himself to protecting his people. Prince Arthur was educated carefully, studying under the well-known humanist physician Thomas Linacre, and made a grand marriage to a Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, when he was 14 years old. Unfortunately, the prince had never been very strong. He was carried off by a sweating sickness a few months later. The crown passed to his brother, who became Henry VIII. England was now on a course for radical transformation. A man who turns his kingdom upside down on a personal whim, who executes 2 of his 6 wives, can hardly be called chivalrous. It's far from what his father had in mind when he invoked the name of Arthur. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like this video if you did, and I invite you to make comments below.